Welcome back to the Gregarious Technology YouTube channel. In this video, we'll be covering the Trusted Platform Module TPM technology and the boot up, or otherwise known as startup security and options, as a complete coverage and walkthrough. And we're going to be using BitLocker and Intune as a model. I do have a whole separate video on this with Intune and BitLocker, so check out the hyperlink shown here. We're not going to be going into a complete deployment with BitLocker and Intune. Just want to cover the Trusted Platform Module, the TPM stuff, and the options. So we won't be going into detail on the BitLocker end of it with Intune. We'll just be covering the TPM boot up, security options, those kind of things. So now let's go into the overview of what we'll be covering. So first, we'll be covering what is TPM. Let's understand what TPM is, what it means, what are the requirements, those kind of things. Next, we'll cover what is secure boot and why is that important. And after that, we're going to get into the main part of the important information that we need to know for all about TPM and the startup options. The secure startup methods, the boot options, the pros and the cons. And we'll spend a bit of time on that. Then finally, we'll get into a bit of demos with BitLocker using TPM. All right, let's jump right into it. All right, so what is TPM? Trusted Platform Module, TPM, is a secure, tamper-resistant hardware chip on the motherboard. So if you want to use TPM, you've got to have a motherboard that supports it. And for Windows encryption, it's got to be 1.2 compliant. So any modern motherboard or system that is designed for corporate environments is going to have that on it pretty much. Just want to double check. It enhances computer security by securely storing cryptographic keys and performing cryptographic operations to protect sensitive data. So it stores these keys on the chip, and we'll talk about those keys in a little bit, what kind of keys we're going to use, and to perform the operations such as, what type of startup method we're going to use on that chip. It serves as a root of trust for the system startup process. TPM needs to be enabled in the BIOS. That's important. So TPM can be used for BitLocker disk encryption, which we're going to demonstrate in this video, Windows Hello for Business, and FIDO2 security keys, which are basically USB flash drives. Just a little bit about FIDO2 security keys, USB flash drives. YubiKey is a very popular one. They have a fingerprint reader on it. It's a multi-factor authentication device. Can be used with multi-factor systems like Duo or Microsoft Azure, MFA, Microsoft Entra ID, MFA, whatever you want to call it. Windows Hello for Business. That's what you need for the multi-factor authentication if you're going to use a security device, or Windows passwordless authentication as well. Again, we're not going to focus on setting up the FIDO2 security keys or anything like that. Just wanted to mention it here. If you wanted some more information, then you just need to do your research on that, because we're not covering Windows Hello for Business or Windows passwordless authentication. Just wanted to let you know that the TPM chip is responsible for those types of security methods. So now let's talk about what is secure boot Secure Boot is a security feature that helps protect your computer from malware and unauthorized software by verifying the integrity of the boot process. It ensures that only trusted software, like the operating system, can run during startup. This helps prevent malicious software like rootkits and bootloaders from taking control of your system before the operating system loads. So, requirements are a recent version of the UEFI, the Unified Extensible Firmware Interface firmware on your motherboard, a supported OS like Windows 10 or 11, but it goes all the way back to Windows 8. It just almost doesn't make sense to talk about Windows 8 anymore. In order to enable, you've got to activate Secure Boot in the BIOS setup. Then you've got to save it and reboot. And one other side note is that you should always protect your BIOS with a password, an administrator password that end users don't know in a corporate environment to protect, not only the end users, but malicious users from using a default BIOS password or something that's easily, hackable so that they can't get in and change these settings. And the reason we're talking about Secure Boot is that once you set that BIOS password, that BIOS administrator password, and then you get in there and you set the TPM settings the way you want, you're secure. If you ignore that, then technically a malicious user could get in to the BIOS with a weak password or a default password and clear the TPM through the BIOS and bypass all security. So you really do want to have Secure Boot. You want to have an administrator password set in the BIOS and, have that secure. So now let's start talking about the different methods of TPM protection during startup. And the first one we'll talk about is TPM-Only. And take a look at the pros and cons with that. So if you're using TPM-Only, that's basically no boot up secondary authentication required. So your computer's going to boot up every time. It's not going to ask for a secondary method, such as a PIN, or require a security device, such as a FIDO2 security key flash drive, like a YubiKey. The pros are it's convenient. There is no user interaction or additional devices required during startup. Users love this, but it's, TPM is going to be required for BitLocker. A malevolent party cannot just simply extract from a BitLocker encrypted drive if they were able to get that computer and, take the drive out or hook up some third-party hardware or device or software, unless the computer boots, because there's no initial startup authentication, and they were able to authenticate to the operating system. Because if they were able to authenticate to the operating system, then BitLocker encryption is decrypted during logout. So, those are the pros. The cons are, which kind of gets into the con. The cons are there is no additional layer of security protection during the boot up, the pre-operating system startup. It's not as secure as the other methods. If the OS authentication is compromised, data leak and security breach are possible, which we just talked about. So the main idea here is it's very convenient for the end user. They don't have to do any authentication to start up the computer, and it'll boot into the operating system. But the downside is the operating system will load. So if a user is able to compromise a user account with a stolen or lost laptop, then it's possible they could actually BitLocker will decrypt and get into that computer and possibly access some sensitive data, corporate data, that kind of stuff. So next is TPM with the startup key. And if this is selected, for example, in Intune BitLocker encryption to be a startup option, part of the encryption key is actually stored on the USB drive, the flash drive, and required to boot up the operating system each time, so that flash drive has to be inserted. The pros are it hardens security with an additional layer of startup protection during boot, and no user interaction required if the flash drive is inserted. They don't have to enter a PIN and remember a PIN. They just have to have that flash drive inserted. The cons are it may seem inconvenient to users. So maybe they forgot their flash drive or left it at home, or they have to stick it in every time. If a user forgets or loses the USB flash drive, the drive that has the partial encryption on it, for example, the FIDO2 YubiKey that requires the boot, it will require a recovery key method. So you would have to go through the recovery method with a recovery key that you stored either in Azure AD/Entra ID, and enter that and say decrypt the drive. If the flash, another comment is if the device and flash drive are lost or stolen together, there's no boot protection, because whoever obtains those together can just simply stick that USB drive in, that flash drive, that YubiKey, and they can authenticate. There's nothing that the user knows and has to type in to have that additional layer of protection at boot time. So let's say that there's a case that the laptop and the YubiKey, the flash drive, is stored in together, and they forget it somewhere, and somebody just picks it up, and they figure out that oh wait, it's asking for a YubiKey. I saw it in my laptop case that I picked up. Well, all they have to do is stick it in because it was stored together, and boom, they're in. So now we come to the method that is a TPM with a PIN. And this is probably the most common approach for a balance between convenience and security. It does require that the user enters a personal identification number, a PIN, during each boot up. So the pros are that it does harden security with an additional layer of startup protection during boot. It does protect against brute force attacks, and it will lock out after a certain number of failed attempts. And if the device is lost or stolen, there's pretty much no way that the PIN is going to be guessed and boot into the OS. And of course, you can't remove that drive and decrypt the drive or access the drive data. So it's pretty secure, unless, of course, they know that PIN from the user sharing that information or something stupid like that, or putting the PIN number on their laptop with a little sticky note. I mean, that's just stupid procedures. Outside of that, there's no way they're going to get that PIN. The cons are, it may seem inconvenient to users. Every time they boot that computer, they're going to have to enter that PIN number. It does require compatible hardware and settings. The motherboard, the BIOS, the hard drive has to be compatible for that. So you have to make sure that your models support TPM with a PIN. Also, users who forget their startup PIN will require the recovery key method for BitLocker or BIOS password from an administrator to clear the TPM. Just one disadvantage, they may forget their PIN. And that's just really the only main disadvantage. So the last method is actually a combination of the two former ones we just talked about. It's TPM with the startup key and a PIN. So in addition to the protection that TPM provides, part of the encryption key is stored on the USB flash drive, the startup key that we talked about, and also a PIN is required to authenticate the user to the TPM. This configuration provides multi-factor authentication so that if the USB key is lost or stolen, it can't be used solely for access to the drive because the PIN is also required. So we've got some pros here. Multi-factor authentication is required. You've got that flash drive plus a PIN. It's the most secure method of boot up requirements. It's the best protection against brute force attacks. It's perfect for highly secure environments. The cons are it may be extremely inconvenient, demanding, and disruptive to end users. So there's a lot of requirements. They've got to have that flash drive. They've got to with the encryption key on it, partial encryption key, and they've got to remember their PIN. Requires compatible hardware and settings. Users who forget their startup PIN will require their recovery key. So that's one part of it, as it was in the section we discussed about the startup PIN. That's still a con. But additionally, if the user forgets or loses their USB flash drive, will also require the recovery key method. So if either one of those happens, they're going to have to get that recovery key from wherever it's stored in Entra ID, or if it were stored in a CSV file or password vault or somewhere, that's going to have to be recovered to recover the drive. So if either one of those conditions or both are true, then you've got to recover the drive by getting the BitLocker recovery key and initiating a BitLocker recovery on that drive. So now we've discussed all the terminology, technologies, and covered all the different methodologies for the startup options with TPM. And next, we're going to move on to some demonstrations, some demos with BitLocker and how to configure BitLocker and what it would look like with some of these options. So let's jump right into that section. So let's first take a look at a policy I created for BitLocker and Intune for a PIN. Go ahead and take a look at things that I have configured to take a look at how I've configured this. So we are not going to go into all the BitLocker settings because I have a whole separate video on that. And so check out my link right here on the BitLocker complete guide. But I do want to go into the requirements for startup, TPM, and those kind of things, and just take a look at those specifically. So if we take a look at BitLocker requirements, again, not going deep into this, We want to require BitLocker. We want to allow standard user encryption and disable the warning for other disk encryption. And that's pretty much it in there. For the BitLocker drive encryption, those are pretty standard. Again, look at my video for this. I'm not going to go into great detail about that in this video because this is more on TPM and startup options. Main thing is the operating system drives settings. So let's take a look at those. And so let's scroll down a little bit to get as much of a view as we can on these. And so I'm going to zoom out just a little bit. Hopefully it's not going to affect anything for your visibility in this video. But the section I really want to focus on is the section that talks about require additional authentication at startup, because that's what we're really talking about in this video. This whole section right here. And it goes beyond here, but we'll talk about some more of that as we scroll down. So if we want to enable or require additional authentication during startup, which is the whole TPM thing we're talking about, then we have to select right here for that to be enabled. For a PIN scenario, pre-operating system load, I'm going to set allow BitLocker without a compatible TPM chip to false. I don't want a flash drive or startup key. And most importantly, these next few configurations are most important to correctly configure BitLocker in Intune for a startup PIN. Do not allow anything with a startup key. And this one is very important. Allow startup PIN with TPM. If you try to require startup PIN with TPM, and you have not already got BitLocker drives encrypted and the user has already went through the startup PIN procedure through either BitLocker Wizard or Manage BDE through the command line, it's going to fail and your policy is going to fail and BitLocker will fail. It's just a bad situation. So it's important to realize that if you're going to require a PIN, what you really have to do is allow a PIN through Intune in the BitLocker settings, and then the user is going to have to manually enter that PIN through a configuration wizard once that policy gets applied to their machine and they log in. There is an article on how to automate this completely, but it's very complex. Requires scripts, and it's beyond the scope of actually anything I've ever done. But if you want to deploy that in your environment, I'm providing the link right here. So take a look at that. But it's beyond the scope of just what we're talking about in this video. But I do want to provide it for those of you who are interested in fully automating this. The idea here is that the user has to enter their PIN at some point. So how do we automate that? It has to run underneath the context of the system and not the user and all that kind of stuff. So take a look at this article if you're interested. You do want to configure the length of the PIN for startup. The minimum is 4. I set 8. You can try it at 4 or 6 if you want. The next few ones are not configured. That works fine. This is all tested. You'll see that in just a minute when we go through our demo. You do want to select enabled for use of BitLocker authentication, requiring pre-boot keyboard input on slates for the tablets and stuff like that. Otherwise, there's no way for them to enter their PIN. Scrolling down a little bit, I know there are some influencers, some great people out there, great knowledge, great experience, who will say, do not, it's not necessary to configure this next section right here. And I completely disagree. There, you will hear some experienced people say that, well, it's going to be automatically backed up your recovery keys into Azure. I don't buy that. I want to make sure that before the BitLocker drive is encrypted, whichever one's operating system, fixed drives, external drives, that it's not encrypted until we are guaranteed that the recovery key is in Azure. So I don't buy that it's just going to happen if we don't say that it must happen before the drive is encrypted. So this section is very important to me. And that's it for a working configuration. I am actually going to present this working configuration in my lab environment so that you see it works in a demo in just a couple seconds. So take a look at these settings. Some of them are very, very important. You will not pull this off with a PIN without the considerations that I mentioned. And then let's go on to the demo now. So we now see the notification that pops up that we want to click on. But if we miss it, it's no big deal. We can go to this PC in the operating system drive and go to Manage BitLocker. We see that the current state says it's encrypting. So we'll let it rip for a little bit. Now we see that BitLocker is on, the drive is encrypted. What we want to do is direct the users to change how this drive is unlocked at startup. Now I know this is a bit of user interaction, but unfortunately the user has to set their PIN, and this is a necessary step. So we will go ahead and click on that. And then we will go ahead and click on Enter a PIN, recommended. And we will put our PIN in there. And confirm it. And set the PIN. And now we have a PIN that's going to be required during startup. We can see that this recovery key was stored to Azure, so we're good on that. Even if they forget their PIN, we've got a recovery key and a recovery method that we can resort to. So that's good. You want to verify that. So we are going to go ahead and restart the computer and take a look at what it looks like during startup for the startup PIN. So let's go ahead and do that. So this is really quick. There's not much to talk about in here. We're just looking at what happens during the TPM PIN process. You got to enter your PIN. The computer is going to boot up, and then it's going to ask for your Windows credentials when the operating system loads, and that's all there is to it. That's the end of the What a process. So now let's take a look at a BitLocker policy in Intune that I've created for a startup key / flash drive. If we scroll down to the configuration settings that I've already configured and edit those, again, we're not going to take a look at all the baseline BitLocker settings that I've already included in a separate video, but I do want to point out a couple things. First of all, I did opt in this one to enable warning for other disk encryption. The reason I did that is because I do want to enable that wizard that pops up. If you don't enable this, it's 6 of one, half dozen another. Then the little pop-up they get up in their notification window, if they miss it, then they'd have to go to their, their file explorer and click on the C drive, right-click on it, and go to, BitLocker options to enable BitLocker if they miss that little pop-up window. But if you enable this, then there will be the wizard that pops up, and that'll stay up until they click through the options. Even though the options are only warning for other disk encryption, it'll pop up and stay there. And when they click on that and just say, well, don't warn me about that, it'll still bring them to the other options, and it'll stay there instead of the window for just, hey, your organization has said, you need disk encryption. If they miss that, then they won't know to get back there. So let's collapse that. BitLocker drive encryption, same thing as we've always done. I'm just going to not go into that too much. Operating system drives, that's where everything is. Let's scroll down so we can see some of these options. Again, for this discussion, this video, what's important is this whole section on require additional authentication at startup. That's what we're going to be focusing on. So for a startup key, I highly recommend that you set these settings exactly the way they are that I've got highlighted right here in the box. The reason is, if you don't do it that way, you might have a notification that says when you go to apply this in your test group, your pilot group, of course you want to always test this and pilot it before you pull it out to production, of a conflict in policies, and that error is shown right here. So I recommend just setting these the way I have them set here, and then when they go through the wizard, they will have the options available to be able to set that startup key on the flash drive. The rest of it is not configured until we get down to the section right here when it asks about, well, first of all, we want to enable use of BitLocker authentication requiring pre-boot keyboard input on slates, of course, for tablets and those sort of devices. But most importantly, choose how BitLocker protected operating system drives can be recovered. So we want to configure this section right here. And again, I don't care what other people on the internet say. I think it's very important that we configure this. I absolutely want to make sure that the recovery key is stored to Azure. before any encryption happens on the hard drive. We want that recovery key in case things fail. So these are the same options that we set in the policy, the encryption policy, the BitLocker encryption policy for using it with a PIN. Just make sure you set these, and we should be good to go. And that's pretty much it for configuring BitLocker with a startup key where part of the encryption key is stored on a flash drive. So let's jump right into the demo section and let's see how this works. Okay, so now we see the encryption needed. We'll click on that, and we will see the pop-up for the wizard for our startup key requirements. And we will go ahead and go through the selections in this wizard. We will say, I do not have any other disk encryption, and do not ask me again. And yes, I am ready to start encryption. And it will bring us to the device encryption settings in the control panel. Again, this is something that you will have to give end users instructions on. And unfortunately, because we want a startup key on a flash drive, they're going to have this interaction with BitLocker. But all the settings are set through Intune for BitLocker, so they'll have pretty much preset options in here. So let's go to BitLocker Drive Encryption and click on that. So now we will go ahead and click on Turn on BitLocker. And we will click on Insert a USB flash drive. We will select the USB flash drive and click on Save. It looks like I forgot to format that USB drive with either FAT32 or NTFS volume, so I'll go ahead and do that right now. And then I'll click on Save again. And let's give it a shot again. We definitely want the recovery key in case we lose that flash drive to be saved to our Entra ID account. So we're going to click on that. And then click on Continue. And we'll see that a restart is required. So let's go ahead and restart the computer. And so we see that the encryption is in process. If we click on that, we see that it is encrypting. Let's give that a little bit of time. So now we see that the BitLocker encryption is on. So we're good to go on that piece. We've configured things correctly. And we also want to make sure that those recovery keys are stored in Azure AD/Entra ID. And for sure they are. And this would be used in the case that flash drive was lost or stolen, so that we could decrypt the drive with a recovery key and get into Windows and manage BitLocker in another manner and change the startup behavior and all that kind of stuff, or do a new flash drive or pin or whatever, or just disable BitLocker temporarily. So that's good. And lastly, we want to see what the behavior is when you start up your computer and forget or lose your flash drive that has part of that encryption key. What does it look like? You know, we can simply just plug in that flash drive again, or we can recover with a recovery key. So let's take a look at that. Let's go ahead and shut this machine down. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at what happens if we boot our computer without the flash drive, and what are the options. Notice we have two options. Press enter to reboot and try again, which would be to enter that flash drive and press enter and reboot and try again. And the second one is to press escape for BitLocker recovery, which would require that BitLocker recovery key, and we can enter that to bypass the flash drive if it were lost or stolen. So let's go ahead and see what it looks like to just enter that flash drive and reboot. So let's give it a little bit of time. We entered that flash drive into the USB port, and we're waiting for a reboot. The computer is rebooting. It's getting that recovery key from the flash drive. And boom, we're back into the operating system menu. We see that the operating system drive is encrypted. We see that the flash drive holds part of the encryption key. I hope that you have enjoyed this video. Don't forget to subscribe, like, comment, and click on alerts to get alerts for and notifications for future videos. Check out all my other future videos and current videos. Share with everybody else you know. And keep returning to my channel for new content. Thanks and have a great day.